Hey guys, welcome back to another episode. Here, we're just going to really be doing something different today where we quickly break down our thoughts on a particular superstar. And that guy is Luka Doncic, someone who we know is a very particular basketball player, someone with very specific needs to satisfy his basketball talent when he brings to the NBA. And when we're judging and talking about the concept of heliocentric roster building, there are only a handful of names of guys in the league that teams would actually consider investing in. You know, you have guys like your Trae Youngs who sum this up like utterly. You know, you have guys who have shown flashes of heliocentric success with guys like Cade Cunningham, LaMelo Ball, who are still relatively young but are extremely intriguing for their respective teams, who may lean in towards heavily tailoring their roster towards their needs. But in recent NBA history, no one has illustrated this so clearly than Luka Doncic himself. Someone who has proven to actually deliver real postseason results as well for a team that solely revolves around him. And he's proven how much you can achieve with multiple deep postseason runs in 2022 and 2024. And before we get to the Lakers and what the Lakers in general need to focus on and harp on over the next few years to build a competitive roster around their new superstar, it's important to look at the evidence that we've seen from these Luka-led teams. Because from what we saw last season, I think it's even a debate for LA if they should take a gamble on a guy like Luka, who has been very inconsistent relative to other megastar level athletes in terms of the durability, the conditioning, and then the skill piece as well from year to year. For me, I think it is a brutal point. I mean, you've seen champions have megastars like your SGAs, your Nikola Jokic's, your Giannis's. And these are just guys who simply don't have the continuous unpredictability year by year that we've seen from Luka. And it's not just the small health concerns, it's the physical commitment issues, which have popped especially in the last 12 months. And that was a major reason for the Mavs calling it quits despite making the finals just a year prior. And looking back, it's still crazy to pull the plug on someone who was a top 2 player on the planet just a year prior. But obviously, in hindsight, looking onto how Luka really transitioned to LA, obviously it is a hard transition. But there's a lot of credibility to be seen from Nico Harrison's decision and the Mavs themselves. You know, and they've seen a massive, huge identity shift within the last 6-8 months with the Luka trade. And you know, that gives other surrounding guys on their roster more opportunities to grow. And that is vitally important, especially with new number 1 pick and Cooper Flag. And that's something that when you're playing the heliocentric style of basketball, you can't have your other guys growing and developing into these real quality pieces who can take these possessions, because so much of the usage rate is in Luka Doncic's hands. And with the drop-off from the peak version of Luka from what we saw last season, where he was one of the top-tier greatest offensive engines that we've ever seen, and we are highlighting that 2024 NBA season, there has been a build-up of inconsistency since then. You know, varied times and stretches on the floor, commitment fluctuations that we've seen, with the substantial decline in overall value as well. We talk about the defensive stuff that he brings. And harping on the defensive side, I mean, 2024 Luka, that was already a major low point in terms of what he actually brought on the value side on defensively. But where the Mavs really struggled and what really led to their downfall was the fact that they couldn't contain the versatility and the plethora of offensive initiation that the top tier teams in the league, like what we saw from the Celtics, had. And that just, in terms of the relentless hunting at Luka, the mismatch attacking from all 5 spots on the floor, it's extremely hard to cover for that when you have a guy so putrid in isolation, with someone that takes such a taxing load offensively and doesn't have the energy to be able to exert on the defensive end. And that is really just the ultimate common trend with Luka on the floor. I mean, with financial concerns as well, that this is another aspect, it's almost impossible to have balanced two-way guys to fill out an entire roster that can also completely disguise the lack of athleticism that Luka's frame presents nightly. It's extremely hard. I mean, teams are already struggling to make financial decisions with their players on their roster. You only have a limited salary cap before you enter the second apron as well. And you really got to be smart with your decision making, but it becomes really hard to bring in 4 other guys on the roster who are able to start and are able to provide that two-way value that can disguise someone so awful on that end of the floor. And, you talk about the energy toll that he takes, the high usage, high possession demands of a Luka Doncic, that basically just leaves him with minimal energy to give to be able to battle and hold up, at least in those like coverages when he is guarding one-on-one, when he is guarding from the weak side corner, when he is trying to be hidden. He really has nothing to be able to try and keep in front of players in terms of the energy side. And it's really just the multitude of factors on this end. Like, on defensively, I mean, he already has a terrible base frame, as we just mentioned before. He's got poor energy conservation, typically brought about by the uncontrollable factors with a heliocentric type of offense. But it's also just the poor fundamentals. And like, all of these things aren't going to give him any sort of credibility on the defensive end. And there aren't many easier things for high-level creators to do in this league than to simply beat Luka Doncic off the dribble when they do play the Lakers, or when he did play for the Mavericks night to night. You talk about just the lateral shifting, it's completely stagnant. Luka's actual ideals defensively in isolation coverage, he aims to actually wall you off with his physical strength. But in terms of the lateral shifting, he struggles and fails to cut off any angle that you take when you try to counter him. And even just simple quick first steps from plus athletes is just enough to get those downhill angles against him and create those running advantages. And that's where you really saw like an agile frame like Jaden McDaniels just completely decimate Luka Doncic's closeouts in that Lakers-Wolves series last year. And in general, it's just so much harder to win when your defense is so disgustingly bad, like what we saw just from the Lakers as a whole last year, when you're basically just giving another team an all-star level player within the series, just with how many angles and easy avenues for dribble penetration that you are giving up continuously. And in terms of the actual movement and foot speed, which already isn't great, I mean, there was a visible decline in his ability to attack those angles offensively when he does get his defenders' hips open. So athletically, in terms of like the base of his frame, he's not really projected to have much success here. And like typically for Luka, what we saw in the 2024 postseason, especially before the nagging injuries caught up to him in the finals, it really only required a simple crossover dribble to vary and threaten some sort of misdirection for Luka to be able to get those driving angles where his power and frame do the rest of the work for him. And some of that initial burst that he had in that 2024 Mavs run, that's completely left him, especially what we saw from last season when the conditioning factor has caught up to him. And that has severely limited the shot selection for Luka and his ability to generate that powerful momentum downhill and get those easy shots around the rim, which has made him such a big physical creator in this league. And with all of these concerns, I mean, it's hard because you're still tossing up a guy who simply gives you like 28, 8, and 8 with still a very playoff resilient, play style. And that is why we do view Luka so highly in this league. Talk about the floor raising of a guy of his caliber, it's immense. And we've been able to see it since his rookie year continuously, and the individual ceiling that he can hit as well when he gets the shot making going to a destructive rate. And when the matchups are weak for him and he can shed back down and attack multiple different mismatches, like that's when Luka is at his absolute best in terms of value amongst the league, and why he may be the second best offensive player in the league when he is at his typical form. But in hindsight, from what we've seen in the past year, in a league where we are seeing teams, building some of the most versatile and consistent defensive rotations, teams with tons of guys who can compete athletically and provide that high intensity approach to their defensive coverage. And basically like the teams that are so great at limiting the mismatch attacking against them, where that gets diminished as well. And particularly in the postseason, we saw this with Luka when he ran into the 2024 Celtics and when he ran into the 2025 Wolves from just this past playoffs. And that has been a common trend that he's run into and he's had trouble trying to beat. Just the tons of competent and mobile physicality that both of those teams were able to throw at his way, just denying him those simple advantages that he craves. And that's why we saw in that Wolves series, like his shot selection just gets hurled out the window and he's jacking up some of the toughest shots, that any player could really settle for. The concerns around Luka, though, are extremely vivid, way more concerning building around a guy like him than the portable megastars around the league like your SGAs, Jokic's, Curry's, LeBrons of the world, guys that can fit into really any sort of NBA system that you chuck him in. But it's just the insane offensive ceiling that he's going to give you that literally can carry your team in spurts. And that is really what LA, and like what every single fan base amongst the league is so intrigued by. And the Mavs have just already proved how much success you can achieve with the ideology of heliocentric basketball in the modern era. And there is much to be happy about from what they've been able to achieve and what you can be encouraged by in your future. There is so much reason to believe that the Lakers can soon build something special around Luka. And now flipping to reviewing that 2024 Mavs squad, obviously Luka's had his flaws even before this past season. But in terms of that 2024 Mavs squad, we saw the most competitive and outright best team that Luka's been surrounded with his entire career. And that was the clear blueprint for success for a Luka Doncic-led offense. And that Mavs team really just gave us a guide of how to hide as much of Luka's weaknesses and also coat him with sufficient surrounding talent that does accentuate his greatness as much as possible. And obviously, they fell short, but that Mavs team was a top 2 team in 2024. And with a few tweaks, I mean, they may have been able to slay that freakishly talented Celtics team in the finals if a few more pieces went their way. I think some people believe that there's merit in surrounding your heavy on-ball guards with high-level pick-and-roll bigs, and that is true. That's why, the Mavs tried to bring in Kristaps Porzingis and see how that tandem worked, because there is value in having someone who finds his spaces on the floor in movement and from working in the post. And obviously bringing in someone from all-star quality at this piece was something that would have been more of a picture-perfect ideal, but obviously the Mavs, in terms of picking their second staff next to Luka, they picked Kyrie Irving, which, having a guy who is a smaller statured guard, that has its own respective advantages compared to, bringing in a second star as a big man. In terms of the conditioning side for Luka, having one of the best and most dangerous ball handling and pure scoring options as your second fiddle just allows a guy like Luka to have those resting possessions from time to time offensively. And something that was absolutely crucial with the detrimental toll that he was taking on the defensive end as well, with teams ruthlessly attacking him. Typically, bigs can't offer that type of ball handling security in playoff environments, especially when teams are throwing such relentless levels of ball pressure your way. And having someone like Kyrie Irving, just someone who can provide a sustainable and versatile offensive option at the highest level, is just something that was so crucial for them in that entire playoff run and throughout the 2 years that they had that tandem together. And the Mavs really just saw the real fit with Kyrie. Bring in someone who could thrive off ball, someone who also brings a more complex shot palette, one of the more diverse shot arsenals that we've ever seen in the league. And this archetype of a small combo guard to pair with Luka, more of a bigger physical guard, is very fitting, especially when you're trying to balance out the mobility traits across the roster. Obviously, defensively was where the troubles really lied for that backcourt, and they did get brutally exposed in that finals run. Obviously, again, we're going to preach on it, but in a league where mismatch attacking is at an all-time high, having 2 below-average isolation defenders and one with pretty bad size disadvantages, as what Kyrie brought, that's a near-death sentence for most teams, especially when you are competing against the elite teams in these 7-game formats. And that was the ultimate downfall when they did run into the Celtics. And though the surrounding roster was tailored to hide the flaws defensively that these two brought as much as possible, I mean, unless you want to give up continuous running advantages to elite creators by fighting over screens and constantly recovering, you need 4 guys on the floor at least who can switch at a high level. And the Mavs just didn't have that in their starting roster or their closing lineups either. But the actual offensive perk of having a star guard creator next to Luka was proven by the Mavs to be successful, and that's where you get the part of the blueprint. And yes, I say a big strength of this tandem was that you can actually alleviate a lot of the conditioning concerns from Luka. I know conditioning is something that can be developed over time, but in reality, it's not like Luka Doncic is really ever going to become that LeBron Steph level of a conditioned athlete, which is what he would need to be in order to thrive playing his style of basketball. And so having that second option, being a skill guard, is a great avenue for a star pairing success. And if you actually want to build up on top of that, obviously bring in someone who has more great hand activity on the perimeter, someone who provides more base strength and more handling ball pressure than what Kyrie did, on top of all that skill stuff that they bring. That is the picture perfect guy that you could land next to Luka. And that's why guys to mind that come to mind for me are, star pairings with guys like Desmond Bane, Donovan Mitchell, Reed Shepherd, guys in the near futures who could replicate a similar role with high levels of defensive stability. And that's where you're going to get your absolute best star pairing next to Luka Doncic. But as we know, it's not just about the star foundation. for these teams that are elite and are contending for the finals, but it's more around the surrounding cast itself that can help you compete on the margins and be those ceiling raisers. And in terms of this Mavs team, you talk about the key elite role players being Derek Lively, PJ Washington, Derek Jones Jr., Daniel Gafford, and Josh Green, guys who admirably serve next to Luka to stabilize such a credible defensive structure with waves of physicality, high intensity, and like foot speed to at least have a chance at competing in constant rotation, which they were inevitably in with the star duo of Luka and Kyrie giving up so many running advantages and easy angles towards the rim. That Mavs team just proved that these archetype of guys is the requisite defensive foundation that you need to surround Luka with if you're going to go for this type of offense. You talk about two hyper athletic bigs that they had, one more vertically explosive on the help side as like a rim protector in Daniel Gafford. Talk about the other one being more of that laterally balanced switchable piece in Derek Lively. And those two guys, in terms of the bigs, they were the absolute perfect complements who were pretty relatively cheap when they did surround them with Luka. And for having star guards who are pretty weak defensively, you need two high motor, super athletic, super space covering bigs. And that's what the Mavs had. And that's why they had so much success against the Minnesota Timberwolves in that Western Conference Final Series. Just having two high screen valued bigs as well. Just immensely important on the offensive side. You talk about the ball handling and passing strengths of a Derek Lively. Then you talk about the roll man vertical spacing that Daniel Gafford provided, and that really made either tandem of these bigs with the guards just a positive complement to any possession that they were involved in. And it's weird to think that without an all-star level big, this Mavs team was so formidable offensively. But the fact is that with how much Luka can actually carry in terms of the load of volume creation, just having bigs that can master their individual roles on the margins is extremely pivotal when you're going for this type of look. You only have so much cap space, like we said before. You got to be smart with how you're going to exert your finances. Exerting tons of effort defensively from this big spot is something that they really got from these all-out athletic bigs. Guys who can deter looks at the rim very credibly. Guys that can provide perimeter stability in spurts. And that's really what Luka individually calls for. Yes, it's nice to have versatile screen setters who have real range and elite creation off the roll. Guys that can flow into high efficiency post-up looks. But in terms of the limited cap space each team has, it's near impossible to surround Luka with two all-star level talents and elite role players. So you got to make the difference here, and I think picking role players to surround this type of offense is probably more credible. You go towards the wings that this Mavs team had. The wings, absolutely tremendous in terms of the defensive look. And in today's game, we know the importance of having multiple different defensive archetypes on the perimeter. Guys who can fulfill different roles against different matchups. Obviously on this team, Derek Jones Jr. was more of your agile and thin frame screen navigator. Someone who did provide that high level recovery athleticism that he could flex. And then you also had PJ Washington in that starting lineup, someone who's more of your physically absorbing forward, someone who is capable of providing low man help possessions with the sheer size and mobility blend that he did bring to the game. And then across the bench, you have more of those high motor point of attack wing stoppers like your Josh Greens and your Dante Exums off the bench. And really just bringing in high quality role players who are designed to perform these off-ball roles and provide plus spot-up shooting is the formula for Luka. Obviously, Dante and Josh Green and PJ and Derek Jones, the actual spot-up shooting, which they're supposed to bring in that designated role offensively, did flame out. But obviously, they did provide the blueprint of what type of roles you need players to cover. In this type of system, you'd obviously need an array of switchable perimeter guys who can switch with ease, because you do need to ultimately cover that defensive hole that is Luka Doncic. And that is obviously a tough task, but we know how admirably this defensive surrounding cast did perform in that postseason run. Obviously, this role player cast wasn't perfect, and that is why they didn't win the title that year, and they did get smoked in that final series versus Celtics. And really, it did stem from the lack of firepower surrounding the two stars, and it stemmed really from the inconsistency and the lack of pure skill and shot-making talent from the wing position in particular, who were the guys that were the recipients of these super high-quality open looks that Luka and Kyrie were able to generate. And continually, we saw how they weren't able to match the Celtics' output of scoring even though the actual looks that they were getting was just that much higher of quality. And that really just got heavily exposed in that final series, especially when there is so much attention on Luka, with so much nail help, so much general attention just directed towards his way. And having guys who can take advantage of that extra gravity that Luka naturally brings was something that would have been way more important for their team to have. And really, when Dante Exum and PJ Washington are your third and fourth best ball handling options as well, it becomes hard to produce and create those consistent, great offensive production looks with guys who can't really extend advantages at a high level, especially during staggered minutes between Luka and Kyrie. Talent-wise, we know this Mavs teams, like the surrounding cast, simply were just so raw offensively for the standard that they needed to be at, and that does take away the energy exertion that Luka can have to put towards, giving at least credible defensive consistency. The Mavs were built well for their situation, but they just weren't at the level of depth of talent that we've seen from teams like the Pacers, the Celtics, and the Thunder. Teams that were able to put together substantially more ball handling and spot-up skill to attack those closeouts and punish on those exceptionally gifted reads that this guy like Luka could create for them. In that final series, Derek Jones Jr. was 3 for 12 from 3, PJ Washington 6 for 22, Maxi Kleber 1 for 6, and when these three guys are your core front court wing pieces and they're struggling to make genuinely open looks with consistency, there's really just literally no chance of outlasting a team with the load of offensive talent and shot-making confidence of the Boston Celtics. But in hindsight, though, looking at this 2024 team and how much success they did achieve, we know that the foundation of this team was rightly chosen. And in terms of the conditioning piece, just by having more competent guys surrounding that star foundation would be more absolutely crucial, and really just for every team to compete. Look at the Pacers from this past year. Yes, they had real star foundation with 2 All-NBA caliber players, but they also had positive and capable connective guys like Andrew Nembhard, Aaron Nesmith, Obi Toppin, TJ McConnell, and Miles Turner, guys who could support the offensive structure of that team. And in this league, to win or at least compete at the highest level, you need elite play creators, but you also need at least capable play finishers. And the Mavs were so close despite the low points in shot making and advantage extending skill that they had on the roster. And if you swapped out a guy like Derek Jones Jr. for a guy like Jaden McDaniels, just in terms of a similar archetype of defender and spot-up option, who knows? The Mavs would have had a much greater chance because they just needed another small jump in offensive boost to keep up with the sustainable creation rate of the Celtics and their pattern to drive and kick offense. And obviously, we're just stepping away from this Mavs, and how they did set the blueprint. It is more relevant to look at Luka's current situation, obviously, and what the Lakers have tried to do in the few months that they've had him on the roster, and what's worked and what is looking pretty awful for the future for them. Obviously, at the time of the trade, the Lakers were playing with fire in terms of the actual winning window with LeBron James at the moment. Obviously, LeBron is now 40 years old, and it's extremely hard to imagine that there's really much left in LeBron's tank of his career, and bring in someone with Luka, like Luka, who has very particular roster needs, and needs that can take years to construct. And in terms of the on-ball dominance and the inconsistent defensive efforts, I mean, the pairing with LeBron at first just sounds a bit questionable. But in terms of the IQ, the portability, and the off-ball value that LeBron can provide you, there definitely is enough to satisfy the superstar pairing. And when you look at the shooting development and the spurts of defensive energy that LeBron can bring you from time to time, especially when the energy and the intensity cranks up by playoff time, that does make the pairing a little bit stronger. And so the actual base of firepower that the Lakers have heading into next season is definitely sufficient for the future for them. For me, though, I am not a big believer of the DeAndre Ayton signing. I don't think that really satisfies what you need from your big position in a situation like this. Offensive creation is really just the furthest problem for this team, especially a team with Luka, LeBron, and Austin Reeves. And that just may be the most complete core of self-creation that we've ever seen. And though the market was weak for the Lakers in the center section, I just don't think Ayton brings really any of the qualities that you need to be able to offer you a strong defensive baseline. There's really just no sugarcoating it. In my opinion, Ayton, especially in Portland, has just been pretty awful as that defensive anchor. Just lazy, uncommitted with his fundamentals and general effort, and someone who just left a ton to be desired. But what the Lakers are really believing in is that Aiden is now in a situation where there really is no excuse for inconsistent energy. And he actually may weaponize some of that mobility and strength blend that we know he has, but we can't really lean on hypotheticals in a situation like this. The Lakers, in the long term, would be substantially better off chasing a highly versatile big man, someone who can run every single coverage in the book, including high-level switchability, and dealing Austin Reeves for that piece may be something that the Lakers will have to look into. I just believe the redundancy of ball handling with a star like Austin Reeves just leaves a lot on the plate for what LA can achieve if they can balance out their strengths, which they currently are far from doing at the moment. Yes, Marcus Smart is a good pickup, but the truth is we actually have no clue what he's going to do because that health has been such a major concern since leaving Boston. He's played only 54 games in the past 2 years, and with Marcus, obviously the defensive versatility of mainly the assignment capability across the board for him is pretty strong. He is a physical body, someone who can track movement to an above average level at this point in his career, someone who does have an easy offensive role as a veteran connected passer, and that does make him a credible slot next to Luka, but it's more about getting more of those types of pieces with more capable offensive upside that will be able to improve the holistic defense of this team, which was absolutely abysmal last season. And that does mean going all in for guys like Herb Jones, Jaden McDaniels, Andrew Nembhard, Aaron Nesmith, that type of archetype, no matter how hard it is to get those guys. And I think just swapping Austin Reeves is just something that is extremely tough to do. But for the contract that he'll be owed next off-season, I mean, you might as well capitalize on his worth and talent as a guy who has reached his peak now at 27 years old. Austin just simply doesn't give you any of the agile and space covering defensive perks that you need him to, and that is absolutely requisite to be able to contain, harass, and deny the league's most dangerous perimeter creators. And especially since there is no real rim protection talent on this team, I just think it makes a move for at least any sort of two-way guy who is offensively a playable piece. It's just such a requisite move that the Lakers need to make. And besides Austin, I'd even look at Rui Hachimura. Yes, of course, you're going to love what he brings as an offensive machine in terms of the spot up, the growth in that jump shot, the reliability in that catch and shoot jumper, and the frequent mismatch attacking possessions that we see from him. And that's all good and all, and he does give you that heightened offensive ceiling, but just defensively, you just need someone who can play that brute physical role, someone who is happy to take that physical punishment each night on stronger assignments, and just being that elite rebounding presence at the 4 position. And that's where you'd really try to look for someone like that: PJ Washington, Dylan Brooks, Tobias Harris, Obi Toppin, Amir Kofi, Al Horford, Pat Williams type of archetype. There's just so many guys that the Lakers can look at, and these guys seem pretty far-fetched options to look at. I just think you might as well go all in and at least attain someone who you can structure a real future with in this Luka era that you guys are entering. In terms of the bench, in my opinion, I think the bench at this point in time, if no moves are made before the season starts, I think you'll have either Rui or Marcus Smart starting on the bench with Jake LaRavia, Gabe Vincent, Jackson Hayes, and Jared Vanderbilt. And so we know how much more important it would be to bring in a little bit more firepower from the bench. And that was something that the Mavs couldn't do, and something that really just bit them in that department. Obviously, Gabe and LaRavia are strong and cheap pickups for them. But moving on from them, we've seen how Vando can get played off the floor so much as an underwhelming offensive guy. But even Jackson Hayes, I mean, another piece that just desperately needs to be moved. I just think the situation heading into next season is completely rough. But you do have to build the foundation for Luka brick by brick. And though truth is, Denver, OKC, and Houston, with them on the rise, you most likely aren't winning anything next season with this core. But more looking towards the future of your time with Luka, kind of just understanding that to host a superstar of his type of play style, you do need to completely tailor to his needs as a basketball player, learning from those previous roster constructions that we've seen him carry success with. And through a heliocentric style of basketball, though it is fading and dying as we look towards these more hypercharged transition-based offenses come into play, it's still a brand of basketball that could produce strongly if backed by the right superstar. And I think Luka Doncic has gotten close enough in his career to earn a franchise's trust. And with that, I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll be back with more off-season content very soon.